So Sam Elsom is I spoke to Sally Hill earlier today, why end with Sam? Why end with Sam's story? And, she told me that Sam Elsom actually sort of embodies everything that purpose is about, right? He's someone who comes from a really creative background. I first met Sam 15 years ago, maybe, about that, when we both worked in the fashion world. And Sam, even then, was trying to find the most ethical, the most sustainable way to make fashion work, to make beautiful creative products work. And that's hard, because fashion is a difficult sector to reform. And then Sam became a climate counsellor. And by being a climate counsellor, he learnt more about the scale of the problems that we're facing, the scale of this challenge. And then he decided to go into an entirely new industry, into the seaweed farming work that you probably know him for. And he has really thrown everything at it. Seaweed farming is one of those things that has the potential to completely transform our economy, our ecology, and to really help to reduce the carbon impacts of some of our most damaging but important sectors like agriculture and livestock. So Sam has been a real champion for a really long time. He's applied that creativity and that care to everything that he's done throughout his career. And that's why we really wanted today to end with Sam's story and for you to hear from Sam and to get a sense of that incredible possibility. So we're lucky because we're going to hear all of Sam and they're going to catch up shortly. So please join me in welcoming Sam Elsom. Come on up, Sam.
Thanks, Jess. Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and also the Muwinina people of Lutruwita, the traditional custodians on the land on which Sea Forest operates down in Tasmania, and also pay my respects to Tasmanian elders past and present. My name's Sam Elsom and I'm the CEO and co-founder of Sea Forest, an environmental technology company that's pioneering the development of seaweed aquaculture to combat climate change. But as Jess said, I don't have a history of seaweed farming. In fact, before starting Sea Forest, I was in the fashion industry. I spent a good part of my 20s in being a designer and creative director in the industry. And it was through that work really that I got to see firsthand, I travelled a lot and I got to work closely with suppliers, but it was through that work that I saw firsthand the heavy social and environmental impacts of the supply chain. From sewing or machining factories with overloaded with people, to the huge amounts of chemical use to dye our clothes and tan our hides. In developing countries like India, where they grow a lot of cotton, they use huge amounts of pesticides and a lot of irrigation. That water runoff ending up in local waterways where communities would be using that water to drink, bathe, and people would regularly get sick and sometimes, they die. But as consumers, we didn't see any of this. We're window shopping for the latest trends. These guys, some of the poorest paid labour in the world, their story wasn't told. And so in 2006, I started a company called Elsom. Our goal is to measure and report the impacts of the supply chain. We developed relationships with primary producers, with textile mills, and also with machinists. We worked, to develop in 2018 a satellite factory in a small community in India where we employed women in the regional community and also education for their children. We also did a lot of work exploring innovative and sustainable textiles, working on post-consumer raw materials and also early concepts around circularity, using waste milk from the dairy supply chain and creating cloth from milk protein fibres. And recycled plastic bottles that we'd turn into sequin dresses. So I'm a little bit behind on my slides, but we were stocked in some of the world's leading fashion retailers like Selfridges, Barney's, Net-a-Porter, and many others. Even at one point had Kate Moss wearing our jeans. It was an incredibly exciting business to be building, but it was a hell of a lot of work. Our cost of production was far greater. As anyone as a lot of you I'm sure have experience in sustainability, the cost of production increases. And so, as compared to our peers who could, send sketches off to China, select fabrics from a book, and have garments delivered back within months, but it was really exciting. And in our own small way, we were having a positive impact. We were disrupting the way things had been done before. Then in 2010, I became a parent. And, all of a sudden, there was something else in my world whose life, was more important than my own. As many of you experience, it's one of the most amazing experiences ever, but it also changes your perspective on the world. I've got 2 children now, and they're growing up in a strange world, heavily impacted by the activities of generations before them. I think my son has nightmares actually about floods and fires, and my daughter knows a hell of a lot more about politics than I did at her age, having participated in the climate strikes. So fast forward to 2017, and I was, as Jess mentioned, in the Climate Council, and was participating on a conference call where Professor Tim Flannery was sharing a recent IPCC report on the status of climate change. And, the results, as you can imagine, weren't very favourable. Tim had a sincere amount of concern in his voice, and I think, one of the most important things I think that the report shared was showing these graphs showing exponential rate of change that we stand to face as a result of inaction around climate change. The call left me feeling really concerned and sort of feeling helpless, but also that call for me was a catalyst to change. It charged me with the feeling like I wanted to do something more. And, following that call, I caught up with Tim, and, I wanted to learn more about solutions. And so, we sat down and he shared with me about seaweed. And I'm not talking about the stuff that gets caught in your hair at the beach. I'm talking about the fast-growing, zero-input crop that both draws down carbon and nitrogen through photosynthesis. And with 71% of the Earth's surface surrounded by ocean, seaweed holds enormous potential. And so, I began to research seaweed, the cultivation, possible markets, and you'd be surprised. Initially I thought, does the world need that much seaweed? And, when I came to research it, I found that actually, we'd be surprised, almost every day we'd interact with seaweed. Everything from toothpaste to skincare, even fertilisers. Seaweeds are powerful biostimulants. There's a myriad of uses for seaweed. In fact, there are some compounds inside seaweed that have been used for that have anti-inflammatory and biostimulant properties. Immunostimulant properties as well. There's an interesting seaweed that grows in Tasmania that has fucoidan, which is an extract that can be taken from seaweed and used as a co-treatment for cancer patients undergoing chemotherapy to reduce the inflammation in their organs. There's an enormous amount of opportunity. But as I looked around, I found that, we in Australia are one of the most biodiverse places on the planet. Of all the 14,000 species of seaweed that have recorded. There are more here in Australia than anywhere else in the world. And yet, when you think about it, seaweed is an $11 billion global industry. In Australia at the time was less than 2 million. And the seaweed that was able to be harvested really came out from beach cast seaweed after a storm. And why this is because there's only about 10 major species of seaweed that are cultivated at scale around the world, and most of those are Northern Hemisphere endemic, and so can't be grown here in Australia. So we had to find a seaweed, a useful seaweed with an addressable market, and then we also had to develop the science behind the cultivation, and that science isn't to be underestimated. Our seaweed, for example, cycles between 3 reproductive life phases. Now, each of these reproductive events triggered by exact environmental cues that align with the lunar cycle, the temperature, the nutrients, all of which happens naturally, each year in nature, and replicate this and scale it. It's a very complicated science that sits behind all of this. But for me, the catalyst for turning my ambition to do something about this into action came about when I learned about research that was happening at the CSIRO in conjunction with James Cook University, where they were feeding 30 different varieties of seaweed to livestock to see the impact it would have on methane abatement. It sounds really bizarre, but what they found was that one seaweed, which is native to Australia and New Zealand, could virtually eliminate methane emissions from just 0.2% of the animal's diet. It's literally a supplement, a dietary inclusion in the animal. It's just remarkable. This amazing discovery had a significant bottleneck, and that is that no one in the world knew how to grow it and there was no commercial supply. Now, why was this important? One, for us, it meant, for me, it meant that here is a native seaweed with a very large addressable market. There are about 26 million cows in Australia, about over 1 billion globally. But cattle, as not many people know, they produce methane. And actually, methane emissions from livestock represent about 75% of agricultural emissions in Australia. And methane as a gas on our atmosphere has 28 times the warming impact of regular CO2. So really important. The other thing that's, it's important to note is that it has a shorter lifespan in our atmosphere. And so when the IPCC or COP26 last year talks about the methane pledge, it's because methane is our only hope in avoiding 1.5 degrees of warming. CO2 stays in our atmosphere for over 100 years. Methane for just 10. So if we can avoid methane emissions, then we can really have an impact and move the needle on emissions reduction. And so this became our focus. The Sea Forest journey began with myself and Stephen Turner, a good friend, and we set about to solve this bottleneck. We were directed down to Tasmania, where in a location where the seaweed was wild and annually abundant. That was really important. So whilst it's native to Australia, it doesn't grow year-round everywhere. We secured a site and facilities, and we set up commissioned research at a number of universities. We had a team of world-leading scientists, and this commissioned research came about through identifying the research gaps. So what knowledge was understood and what do we need to solve? And what we did is we met weekly. So these research teams would come together, we'd Zoom, and we'd find out, what everybody discovered. And it was great. What it did was it created competitive tension between the universities. For us, it meant that we could convert these research outcomes to standard operating procedures on the farm and move rapidly. And over a short 18 months, we developed methods for land and marine-based farming. So it was a remarkable outcome. But, I think for me, as a passionate individual building this business, this was invaluable education in the seaweed and the industry that we were building. Today we have a fantastic team, who are extremely dedicated. We're over 45 people and we're making incredible progress. And it's the people that are our secret to success. and I'm very much grateful for their trust and support, and we wouldn't be here without them. I love seaweed. I love the business that we're building, and I love the impact that we're starting to create. My kids have even pulled me up at times for talking seaweed in my sleep. But to grow, so this is our site down in Tasmania. It's a beautiful waterfront property, and just behind there you can see the inside, that's Maria Island, and we have an 1,800 hectare marine lease, one of the largest in the Southern Hemisphere, completely dedicated to seaweed farming. Research partners. But to grow the seaweed, it may be just worth mentioning before I move on, these tiny little golden sacs that you can see there, that's why this seaweed has magical powers. So inside those cells, which are called gland cells, the seaweed's able to synthesise bioactive compounds from the marine environment. It's about 27, a combination of about 27 bioactives, and it's those bioactives that disrupt the production of methane in ruminant livestock. And what they do is they in the final stages of digestion, where animals are like cattle are producing methane, it reacts with a vitamin B12 enzyme and converts the carbon that would have gone into creating a greenhouse gas, the CH4, into a short-chain fatty acid, which the animal uses to grow fast. So you actually get a positive productivity benefit coupled with a positive environmental outcome. So it's really quite remarkable, but it's all because of those tiny little gland cells. And it's the only seaweed of all the 14,000 recorded species that has this cell structure. So to grow the seaweed, we have taken a parallel approach to cultivation, and it's really because, as I mentioned about the life cycle of the seaweed, there is two distinct life phases. We grow one life phase on land and the other life phase at sea. We have the marine lease I mentioned, and the seaweed is seeded onto ropes which are deployed on structures which are 6 metres below the surface. It takes only 8 to 10 weeks for that seaweed to mature. And the seaweed is then harvested by purpose-built vessels and processed at our facilities into a finished and stable product we call sea feed. On land, it's slightly different. On land, we have these ponds that you can see in the bottom corner, where we utilise seawater, which is filtered and circulates around a pond in a current generated by that paddle wheel. The seaweed photosynthesises, taking the carbon and nutrients from the seawater and the sunlight, and they're the 3 core ingredients for photosynthesis. What's interesting is through land-based farming, the discharge, or the water that we put back to the environment, is more alkaline or oxygenated than the water that we bring in. So even the cultivation of the seaweed has a positive environmental outcome. But what happens is that seaweed fragments and photosynthesizes and increases in density. And so the growth curve plateaus. So we harvest the seaweed every 3 days to make sure that we keep the seaweed in an optimal growth state. And the tail end of that process is the same. We recently purchased a land-based site. So there's our marine farm and the seaweed growing on the long lines underwater. We recently purchased, just late last year, a site 40 minutes up the road. It was a former abalone farm with 660 concrete ponds already in place, almost like swimming pools, with access to seawater. And we are refurbishing this site, this industrially zoned aquaculture site, into a land-based seaweed production facility. And we already have the first 12 of those ponds operational with seaweed. And what we need to do is we need to build up the biomass naturally. So the seaweed grows about 20% week on week when we grow it on land. And so as we build up more biomass, we populate more ponds. So this is a fantastic way of taking a redundant aquaculture asset and turning it into something that's environmentally positive. And then the tail end of that is that the seaweed's relatively simple to process. So literally to create the sea feed product, we mix it with canola oil. We have a patented process and there is a unique formulation, but ultimately, we have a relatively low impact production process. And all of this progress has enabled us to start working with livestock farmers and creating real impact. We've been feeding Tasmanian sheep on an MJ bale farm since, I think, June of 2020. So quite a while now. The sheep from that trial, or the wool from that trial, has been purchased by MJ Bale, who've been creating net zero knits and carbon neutral suits. I'm wearing one of the jumpers actually today. But this is really exciting. And they recently just did their lightest footprint campaign, which a very small amount of that wool was used, and someone cycled it all the way down to the marina, where they then sailed their boat to Geelong, where it was knitted into these garments. But I think that exercise is, it's obviously very small scale, but it shines a light on the fashion supply chain and just how complicated it is to create a truly net zero product. But I think what's important is that the farm we're working with is already carbon positive. He has regenerative agricultural practices in place, and the methane reduction from the sheep for the production of wool actually offsets the logistics of that wool going to Italy to be turned into a fine yarn. And then, in December of 2020, we began feeding 1,200 Fonterra sheep on a contracted farm in Tasmania. Fonterra cattle. Fonterra did a lot of work around food safety, looking at the residues that might, iodine in particular, that might show up in milk products, and getting comfort around milk production returns. That company has now been aggregating the milk into the supply chain. When we first went to Fonterra with a concept of, let's bring a carbon neutral, low methane product to market, they explained that in order to do so, we would have to feed enough cattle to produce a cubic kilometre of cheese consistently. So it just goes to show the scale of these supply chains. It's absolutely enormous. But we're very excited that the Fonterra are allocating more and more farms each year, and that work continues to grow. But it's really important for us. They are actually working on a carbon neutral product that will come out in the next 12 months. But the other thing that's really exciting and that's coming up really soon is that a world first grass-fed trial. So the burger chain Grilled, which some of you might be aware of, we've been feeding their cattle down in Victoria for over 6 months now. Well, actually, the good part of this year, really since January. They're now producing a burger that will go on the menu, which is the first sea-feed burger, which is quite exciting. So those guys have had devices out on the farm where they've been able to measure the methane reduction and make those claims to market. And interesting, the burger chain says that by July of next year, they hope to have the entire supply chain, their entire menu decarbonised. We're also working with one of Australia's largest beef producers, AACO, and premium beef producer Ranges Valley. So these guys are big pastoral companies with thousands and thousands of head of cattle, and so they're beginning to adopt, which is fantastic. I was recently in Europe and in discussions with luxury fashion house Gucci. Gucci take on 65% of their apparel sales or ready-to-wear sales are leather goods. So shoes, handbags, leather jackets, and they take on, they've made a carbon neutral commitment, and they spend hundreds of millions of euros per year, over the years that they've been committed to this, in purchasing carbon offsets. They're now looking at reallocating some of that capital to running trials or starting to feed the cattle so that they can reduce the impact of the supply chain. They take the emissions when they take those hides. And so it's been really surprising to me to see the number of industries that this tiny red seaweed can create positive impact. But, I would say for this solution to really begin to move the needle, we need greater drivers for adoption. An incentive for farmers to make the behavioural change necessary to create meaningful emissions reduction. We need governments to make meaningful commitments on emissions reduction. We've seen recently with the government, moving their commitment from 23% emissions reduction by 2030 to 43%. That's great. The methane pledge that they're intending to sign up to, it's aspirational at this stage, but it's fantastic. It's momentum, it's progress, and we'll take it. But, we continue to lobby the government. We're trying to really make that, get these drivers in place so that we can have the impact that we intend to. But I think, what is exciting is through the cultivation of this seaweed and through the support of our team, we are pioneering the development of a new and environmentally positive industry. And not just exclusively Asparagopsis. There are other amazing seaweeds. We're really just at the beginning of this exciting journey to learn more about the amazing potential in developing an understanding from nutritional profiles to methane busting potential of our native seaweeds. And one of these is the giant kelp Macrocystis, so you can see here. In the 60s and 70s, this seaweed was harvested at scale by mainland companies looking for the gelling agent and create things like margarine. This over-harvesting, coupled with the impacts of climate change warming the East Australian current, has led to 95% of the giant kelp forests around Tasmania to be wiped out. These ecosystems, once abundant, barely exist. So, what the scientists also say is that these ecosystems, this particular seaweed, the giant kelp or Macrocystis, is the foundation species for these underwater ecosystems, supporting life and nurturing. They create the canopy that supports life and the shelter for things like abalone and crayfish and all sorts of other abundant biodiversity. So recognising the importance of this, our team last year turned their attention to closing the life cycle of that giant kelp. Again, it all starts with science. We were able to do so, and we were able to take temperature-resilient strains of that giant kelp and create offspring that would grow onto small stones. And, we provided 250,000 of these small stones to scientists at the University of Tasmania's Marine and Antarctic Studies team and a local community group in Tasmania, where they were able to reforest a whole area of the seabed. We're very excited to report that they're the 250,000 little propagules on the seabed, and over a short 4 months, we created an entire ecosystem. It's really quite amazing. Thank you. So, this year we're now attempting the very first forest-scale giant kelp restoration efforts in the Southern Hemisphere. We're going from 250,000 to 3 million tiny propagules and be reforesting 21 sites around Tasmania to really start to scale and create meaningful impact. We've established the Sea Forest Foundation to drive this work in collaboration with the university. This project is a new frontier of conservation and something we're very excited about. And all of this has really come about because of an urgent need to act decisively around climate change. Climate change and global warming are concepts that have been around for quite a while. We've all heard about them for ages. In the early 2000s, it was something that we needed to address, but that didn't really have a deadline. We couldn't see the impacts on our doorstep. And there were also, it was interesting, at the time, there was arguments on both sides of the fence. I think these days, we're living in a world that the climate scientists have warned us about. We've seen the floods and the fires, and these things seem to be happening more frequently and more intensively, as has been predicted. And I think these days there's unanimous agreement that the world is changing and that this change is accelerated since the Industrial Revolution. So, the impacts of climate change are well and truly on our doorstep. So what are we going to do about it? Got a solution?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. I just wanted to ask you something. You said like the solution is this seaweed, right? My question to you is, you wanted to come up with an idea to make the world a better place or to eliminate our emissions.
Yep.
But if we look at livestock and we look at animal agriculture, it is the leading thing in the world for environmental damage. It's got not just to do with their farts, but it's got to do with their eating process. We need to feed them around 10 to 15 kilograms of grain protein in order to get 1 kilogram of protein. You have land usage. 56% of land usage in Australia is used up by livestock, by grazing. So you're pretty much like contributing to one of the biggest environmental damages on the planet and one of the most unethical as well. If we look at any type of animal agriculture, we always have to feed animals more than what they output. So it is like, I would say that vegan is the future, and that's what we should be striving for. And I want to understand your perspective from that, why you wouldn't be investing in using this seaweed for maybe like plastics or food that we consume directly. But I would say that the animal agriculture is definitely not the future.
Yeah, fantastic question. And I don't dispute any of those points. What I might do is come back to it at the end though, if you don't mind. But definitely, I agree with all those points. Yeah, fantastic. I'm happy to share. I guess, I feel like what I've tried to do here is build and scale something worthwhile that's going to create a meaningful impact today. By feeding this seaweed to livestock, we stop emissions tomorrow. It happens right away. It's quite an immediate impact as like planting forests, and I think we need a myriad of solutions. But when we plant forests, we have to wait for 20 years for those trees to grow and so forth. We can create a lot of impact right now. But there's a lot we can do. There's a lot we can do even as individuals, through the power of our consumer choices. If you don't like meat, don't buy it. I'm not advocating here for that. We're just trying to find solutions. But I also think, demand change from businesses. Think about what you can do with your super funds. I'm sure you will have heard a little bit about that at some point today. Success for Sea Forest is to be significantly reducing emissions. We want to wipe 6 million tonnes of carbon dioxide off our national greenhouse gas inventory through ruminant methane emissions. We also want to draw down copious amounts of carbon through photosynthesis. That's our goal. But I think what's really important to mention here is that it all starts with building strong partnerships with like-minded businesses, and we have to do it together. Sea Forest grows a feed ingredient that has no value unless it's fed to livestock to reduce methane emissions and resolve a problem over there. So, we must work together to create these solutions. But I'll just finish off by talking just a little bit about the career change. It seems really obscure and quite bizarre, but I'm often asked about why and how, and I was able to start Sea Forest without a background in seaweed science or engineering. And I think when I reflect on this question, I think it's just amazing what you can do when you give something your full and undivided attention, your full focus. I would say, if you're interested, put your time into educating yourself, building relationships with thought leaders. You guys are here learning today and tomorrow. And I think, use this and as best you can, turn this ambition you've turned up. Let's take the tools that you learn and let's all put them into action. When I started Sea Forest, I had no idea if it was going to be successful. And, if I'm honest, I've never focused on that. Just on giving the business my full effort and energy, and the progress has come. But this is something anyone can do. I'm not encouraging you to change your career paths, but simply saying that if it's not too late, or if you're feeling scared about making the leap, just start by dedicating some time each day to the education, building that education, upgrading the software and building your confidence, and just see where it takes you. Thanks.
Sam Elsom, everybody.
So
That was so awesome.
Yeah, no,
thank you, Sam.
I'd love to just address that question,
Sure,
really, if you don't mind. So beef production is a huge issue. Beef and dairy production, they have animal welfare issues, they have all sorts of issues associated. I'm not advocating for this, to continue or grow. And I also want to put this in context. What we do today is we grow seaweed. We can feed 100,000 head of cattle. Our goal is to feed 2 million in a very short time frame. But we have 26 million cows on the planet. We have 26 million cows in Australia. We have 1 billion cows on the planet. Huge numbers of livestock. So I get it, and I completely agree with your points. But I also think that we have hope in addressing 1.5 degrees of warming, but we have a closing window of opportunity to do all we can to drive those emissions down. And so what we're doing as a business is focusing on that as a goal. I think that's a separate argument, and I think that's to be taken up with the sector. What we're focusing on is the emissions reduction that can be achieved today.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam.
No worries at all.
That was phenomenal.
Cheers. No worries. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move to Tasmania. I will follow you. That was amazing. Thank you so much, Sam. Wow. What an amazing way to end.